Here's the next story I'm going to read, and there's something kind of special got over the book, which I'll mention later. As those of you who have followed this know, I'm reading from this book of 18 little memoir stories. Stories might be short, but they are definitely not little. They're power-packed. This is number 16. We go borrowing. Borrowing money can become a habit, and it became a habit that trapped my parents, who were always short of money and long on dreams. They borrowed from friends, people who owed them favors stemming from Europe. This was not my parents at their best, and people did judge them, including me. But survival can be an ugly business, and who can say what is right and what is wrong? Sometimes my parents brought me along when they went borrowing, and it was always unpleasant. I knew the spiel, how they had suffered under the Nazis and wanted nothing now but to get back on their feet. My mother cried at all the right places, and it was all true and sincere, and at the same time very uncomfortable. They lost their friends through this, one by one. As for Mr. Wernstock, he was an exceedingly wealthy man. But it had not always been so. In Europe, he had worked for my father as a cutter. My father had owned a handbag factory in Toulouse, and then the Nazis marched in and took it over only months before we made the escape from France to Spain, to Portugal, and finally to Montreal. We had all arrived on the same boat, the Serpent Pinto, a Portuguese pineapple freighter, in which we, the remnants of a generation, made our voyage from the old world to the new. Mr. Wernstock had landed on his feet, swiftly converting his savings into a fortune, and leaving my father very far behind. One Friday night we took the streetcar up to Outremont, the prettiest section, where Mr. Wernstock lived in a castle, surrounded by lawns and fences and stables and tennis courts. My father was very nervous. He had not been invited, and was using chutzpah instead. He had been trying to reach Mr. Wernstock by phone, but could not get him in the office. Mr. Wernstock's office was on St. Catherine Street, on the 22nd floor of the Wernstock building. Observing this fantasy land that was Outremont, my father said, "He was nothing but a cutter for me, you know." In case Mr. Wernstock forgot, my father would remind him. Humorously, of course. Many times, my father said, I lent him money. This was hard for me to believe, but I knew it to be true. There was talk that Mr. Wernstock was personally worth $50 million. My father was asking for but 5,000 of that, pocket money, the kind of money Mr. Wernstock used for change. "Do you remember Mr. Wernstock?" my father asked. I said I did not. "Ha," my father said, "he used to bounce you on his lap." My mother was staying home for this trip. This was between the men, two industrialists, head to head. Big business deals were to be discussed. My father had said more than just money was in the offing. Maybe even a partnership. Maybe Mr. Wernstock would bring him into the business. My father had assured my mother that certainly he'd not go in as a common employee, or even as a common executive. No, something like a partnership would have to be arranged. Already my father could see himself as Mr. Inside. running all of Mr. Wernstock's factories. Of course, if worse came to worse, 5,000 would do. My father now rang the bell by the entrance gate. A voice asked his name. A servant came to unlock the gate. My father said, "You stay here. I may be a while." I was prepared to wait hours. Not in 10 minutes do two men discuss partnerships. But within that time, 10 minutes, my father was back, his eyes fixed on something painful in the distance. He said nothing, nothing to me, nothing later to my mother, and never again was Mr. Wernstock's name mentioned. He had said something dreadful to my father, and I never knew what it was. I think I'll go on to the next story here. A Jewish soldier. This is number 17. My father loved Israel, the ancient and the modern. He also loved America, and there was no question of divided loyalty, because America was Israel. America and Israel were one and the same. If you love Israel, he said, you love America. If you love America, you love Israel. America was the embodiment of the Jewish dream. And what is the Jewish dream? Said my father. Listen to the words of Micah, our prophet. And each man shall sit under the shade of his vine and fig tree, and none shall make him afraid. I don't know if that's Micah or Micah, the name, pronunciation. Both sound good to me. Said my father, what is that, if not the Jewish dream? And what is that, if not the American dream? My father wept the day Israel was declared a state. I was 8 years old then, and we had already been 3 years in Montreal. I was too young to understand everything about Israel, but on the eve of its rebirth, I knew something extraordinary was happening. Daily that spring, the Yiddish newspaper from New York documented the events of the Arab-Jewish conflict. Each morning my father walked along Fairmont Street to Abe's news store to bring back Der Tag. For a man who knew pogroms in Poland, where Jews lived from fright to fright, the tales of daring Jews astonished him. Jews who hearkened back to the days of Joshua and David. One Sunday, I went out to meet my father as he returned with the paper. Look, he said, pointing to a photo on the front page, a Jewish soldier. Then I saw him crying and understood how incredible this was. Now during this time, we were menaced regularly by the French gangs that marched up from below St. Lawrence Street, the dividing line between French and English-speaking Montreal. We were tough ourselves, meaning Duty and Benji, and Yehudi, and all the rest. But we were no match for these French. Pepsis, we called them. Pepsis? Who had the advantage of genetic indignation. They were passionately resentful against anything English, and anything that wasn't French was English. Also, they surpassed us in numbers. There seemed to be no end to them. Down below St. Lawrence, where they bred for hatred, down below St. Lawrence, they were bred for hatred, raised for thuggery. Up from St. Lawrence, they came in waves and attacked. Their crazed, ferocious violence needed no provocation, only bodies, and we were here, especially Sundays. Then they'd be waiting for us at the Talmud Torah Hebrew School. In the province of Quebec, children under 13 are not allowed in regular movie houses. There had once been a theater fire, kids trampled to death, causing such a law to be passed. Schools, however, were exempt. So on Sunday afternoons we flocked to the Talmud Torah for Laurel and Hardy, Roy Rogers, and Gene Autry. I do not use the word flocked in vain, because sheep that we were, we fell to the blows of the Pepsis, who were gathered by the entrance of the Talmud Torah and punished us coming and going. Fight back? Who ever heard of the words? But that week Israel had been declared a state, and that Sunday there had been that photo of a Jewish soldier, and everything changed. We let them have their way when we entered the Talmud Torah, but once inside, the darkened auditorium was no longer that sense of terror. Something unspoken passed between us. We were of a single mind. After the movies, which nobody really watched, the lights came on and we rushed for the doors. I was somewhere in the middle of this army, and by the time I got out, the fighting had already begun. Duty was pummeling the leader of the Pepsis, a boy twice his size. Duty had him propped against a car, striking him repeatedly in the midsection. The Pepsi grew weak in the knees and wobbled to the pavement. This gave us courage, and we went after them one by one. As for the Pepsis, first they were stupefied. What was this? Jews fighting back? Next they turned and tried to run, but we caught them and gave measure for measure. We repaid all debts and even made some deposits for the future. When I got home, I was covered in blood. My mother made me take a bath. She kept muttering about this and that, and as for my father, he gave me a wink and a big secret smile. Excuse the coughing. We have one more to go, and I'll save that one for later. It'll be number 19, and this was 18. People learn as they need, as necessary.